A convoy moved through the Strait of Hormuz under direct naval escort, and insurance markets adjusted their risk models within hours. No shots were fired. No shipping lane was closed. Yet the cost of moving oil through one of the world's most critical choke points quietly shifted. Most coverage focused on the escort itself, treating it as routine deterrence. That is not where the significance lies. The significance lies in what happens when a security guarantee becomes an active, visible service rather than an assumed condition. Because the moment protection becomes explicit, it also becomes conditional. And conditional protection changes how every actor in the system calculates risk. Ship owners begin to ask different questions. Insurers begin to price different scenarios. Buyers begin to consider different suppliers. None of these changes require escalation. They only require a shift in perception. That shift is already underway. The strait remains open. The flow continues. But the assumption that it will always function without visible intervention has been quietly broken. And once that assumption breaks, it does not repair itself easily. What replaces it is a system that depends not only on geography, but on sustained political and military commitment to keep that geography usable. That is a different kind of system, more expensive, more fragile in ways that are not immediately visible, and far more dependent on decisions made far from the water itself. This is not a moment of disruption. It is a moment where the structure beneath the system reveals itself, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. Do you believe a trade route remains stable once it requires constant protection, or has it already entered a different phase that the world has not yet acknowledged? I am Liang. I follow the decisions that rarely make headlines and the patterns that emerge only when those decisions are placed side by side. If this reaches you, then you are already looking beyond the surface. Subscribing is simply how this kind of analysis continues. Roughly 1/5 of global oil consumption passes through the Strait of Hormuz, according to the International Energy Agency. Around 20 million barrels per day move through a corridor narrow enough to be monitored, influenced, and, if necessary, disrupted. That figure is not just volume. It is dependency concentrated into geography. When the United States increases its naval presence or begins active escort operations, it signals more than deterrence. It signals that baseline assumptions about stability require reinforcement. That matters because markets respond not to statements but to perceived shifts in underlying conditions. In past incidents, including tanker attacks in 2019, war risk premiums surged within days, altering shipping behavior without any formal closure of the strait. Verify specific premium spike data. What is different now is not the existence of tension. It is the normalization of active management. When protection becomes routine, it becomes part of the cost structure. Insurance adjusts. Freight rates follow. Contracts begin to incorporate risk that was previously treated as background noise. This process is incremental but cumulative. It does not produce immediate headlines. It produces gradual changes in how the system operates. The stakes in 2026 are therefore not defined by whether the strait closes. They are defined by whether the cost of keeping it open continues to rise, because that cost does not disappear. It is absorbed by shipping companies, by insurers, by importers, and ultimately by economies that depend on stable energy flows. For countries like China, which imports more than 10 million barrels per day, verify latest IEA figure, much of it linked to Gulf supply chains, this is not an abstract concern. It is a structural vulnerability that becomes more visible each time the system requires intervention to maintain normal function. And once vulnerability becomes visible, it begins to influence strategy in ways that are not immediately announced. The first analytical layer is therefore not about conflict, but about control over the conditions that allow global trade to function. The visible fact is straightforward. The United States maintains the capacity to secure maritime routes through sustained naval presence. That capacity has been demonstrated repeatedly over decades. Freedom of navigation operations, convoy escorts, and rapid response capabilities form a system designed to ensure that critical corridors remain open. On the surface, this appears stabilizing, and in immediate terms it is. Ships move, oil flows, markets avoid panic. But one layer deeper, the existence of this capacity creates a dependency. If stability depends on continuous intervention, then stability is no longer inherent to the system. It is provided. This distinction matters because provided stability can be adjusted, scaled, or withdrawn. Not arbitrarily, but in response to broader strategic priorities. The United States does not operate in a vacuum. Its naval deployments reflect global commitments, budgetary constraints, and shifting strategic focus, particularly toward the Indo-Pacific. This introduces a variable into the equation that did not exist when stability was assumed rather than actively maintained. The contradiction emerges clearly. The system functions because it is protected, but the protection itself is subject to strategic calculation. For China, this creates a layered challenge. Its energy security is deeply tied to maritime routes that it does not control. Efforts to diversify, including pipeline projects and overland corridors, reduce but do not eliminate this dependence. Maritime transport remains the most efficient way to move large volumes of oil. That efficiency comes with exposure. When the reliability of maritime routes depends on the actions of another major power, energy security becomes linked to geopolitical alignment, whether explicitly acknowledged or not. There is also a temporal dimension to consider. Infrastructure decisions are made over decades. Tanker fleets, refining capacity, strategic reserves. These are long-term commitments built on assumptions about future stability. When those assumptions begin to shift even slightly, the implications extend far beyond immediate market reactions. They influence where investments are made, which partnerships are prioritized, and how risk is distributed across the system. The complexity deepens when considering that the United States benefits from maintaining this role. By providing security for global trade routes, it reinforces its position as a central actor in the international system. This is not simply a military function, it is an economic one. Control over the conditions of trade translates into influence over the terms of trade. Yet this influence is not absolute. It is negotiated continuously through presence, credibility, and the willingness to bear the cost of maintaining that presence. And this leads to a tension that does not resolve easily. The more visible the role of the United States in securing Hormuz becomes, the more other actors are reminded of their dependence on that role. That awareness can drive diversification efforts. It can also reinforce the existing system if alternatives are insufficient. The outcome is not predetermined. It depends on how each actor interprets the balance between risk and cost. At the deepest level of this first angle, the question is not whether the strait remains open. It is who ultimately controls the conditions under which it remains open and how that control shapes the strategic choices of those who depend on it. The economic dimension of this shift is not about supply disruption. It is about how risk is priced before disruption occurs. The surface fact is simple. No sustained closure of the strait has taken place. Oil continues to move at volumes that remain broadly consistent with historical baselines. Yet freight rates, insurance premiums, and forward contracts begin to reflect a different assumption about stability. The London insurance market, through the Joint War Committee, periodically designates high-risk zones, and the Gulf has been repeatedly flagged in past periods of tension. When that designation tightens, premiums rise within days. This is not speculative. It is procedural. Ship owners pay more. Charter rates adjust. Cargo costs follow. One layer deeper, this pricing mechanism acts as a quiet transmission system for geopolitical stress. It distributes the cost of uncertainty across the global economy without requiring a single shot to be fired. Import-dependent economies absorb higher input costs. Exporters adjust margins. Traders hedge differently. The system adapts in real time, but adaptation is not neutral. It redistributes pressure. For China, which relies heavily on seaborne crude imports from the Gulf, the effect is cumulative rather than immediate. According to data compiled by International Energy Agency, China has remained the world's largest crude importer in recent years, with Gulf suppliers accounting for a significant share of those flows. Even small increases in transport and insurance costs, when applied to millions of barrels per day, translate into measurable economic impact over time. And this is where the surface reading begins to break, because higher costs alone do not explain the strategic shift. The deeper implication lies in who controls the variables that generate those costs. The United States does not set insurance premiums directly, but its actions influence the risk environment that insurers price. Naval deployments, escort operations, and public signaling all feed into the perception of stability or instability. This creates a feedback loop. Increased presence reduces immediate threat perception, but it also confirms that the environment requires active management. Insurers respond to both signals simultaneously. Stability is maintained, but at a price that reflects its conditional nature. Now consider an actor whose perspective is often reduced to a single dimension in Western coverage. Saudi Arabia. As the largest exporter within OPEC, its position is not simply to move oil, but to manage market balance. Saudi policy has historically adjusted output in response to price volatility, sometimes increasing production to stabilize markets, sometimes restricting it to support prices. When transport risk increases, even without supply loss, Saudi Arabia faces a dual calculation. Higher prices may benefit revenue, but sustained volatility can damage long-term demand stability. This is why Saudi officials have consistently emphasized market predictability in OPEC+ communications, verify specific OPEC statement. Their interest is not chaos, it is controlled equilibrium. Understanding this position changes the picture, because it reveals that not all actors benefit from rising tension, even if prices rise temporarily. For China, higher prices and transport costs are negative. For Saudi Arabia, they are conditionally positive but strategically risky. For the United States, increased involvement reinforces influence but raises operational and political costs. The system is not aligned. It is balanced through competing incentives. At the deepest level of this economic angle, the consequence is structural. If the cost of securing maritime energy routes continues to rise, alternatives become more attractive even if they are less efficient. Pipeline projects, strategic reserves, diversification of suppliers, none of these replace maritime transport, but they alter its relative importance. China's long-term investments in overland energy corridors, including pipelines from Central Asia and Russia, reflect this logic. They are not substitutes. They are hedges against precisely this kind of risk environment, but hedging introduces its own complications. Overland routes carry geopolitical dependencies of their own. They tie energy security to relationships with transit states and upstream suppliers. They reduce exposure to maritime chokepoints, but increase exposure to political dynamics along the route. There is no risk-free alternative, only different configurations of risk. And this leads to a quiet but significant shift. The more the maritime system requires active stabilization, the more actors invest in parallel systems that reduce reliance on it. This does not collapse the existing system. It fragments it. Over time, fragmentation reduces the efficiency gains that made globalization so powerful in the first place. Trade becomes more resilient in some ways, but less optimized in others. Costs rise not sharply but persistently. The economic dimension, therefore, reveals something that the military framing alone does not capture. Stability is being maintained, but the price of maintaining it is being distributed in ways that reshape long-term strategy. And those strategies, once set in motion, do not reverse easily. They build new dependencies, new alignments, and new constraints, which raises a deeper question that cannot be answered by looking at costs alone. Because beneath the pricing mechanisms and trade flows, there is a more fundamental shift taking place in how power is exercised through systems that appear, on the surface, purely economic. There is a layer beneath this that most discussions never reach, because it requires stepping outside both the military and economic frames at the same time. The visible fact is that global trade routes are physical. They are defined by geography, secured by navies, and used by ships. That is the surface. The deeper reality is that these routes are also institutional. They depend on shared expectations, legal frameworks, and a collective belief that certain spaces remain open to all. This belief has been reinforced for decades through practice rather than constant demonstration. Now consider what happens when that belief begins to require visible enforcement. The institutions do not disappear. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea still defines navigation rights. The principle of transit passage through straits used for international navigation remains in place. But the lived reality of that principle begins to change when enforcement becomes routine rather than exceptional. The system shifts from assumed compliance to managed compliance. This distinction is subtle, but it carries profound consequences. Because assumed compliance allows for decentralization. Managed compliance requires a central actor with both capability and willingness to enforce the rules. In the current system, that actor remains the United States. This creates a structural asymmetry. The rules are nominally universal. The enforcement is not. For China, this asymmetry creates a strategic dilemma that cannot be resolved quickly. On one hand, it benefits from the existing system. Its trade depends on open sea lanes. On the other hand, it lacks equivalent global naval capacity to guarantee those lanes independently. According to data from Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, China's naval expansion has been rapid, but its ability to project sustained power into distant choke points remains limited compared to the United States. Verify specific deployment capability comparison. This gap is not simply quantitative, it is logistical and institutional. And this is where the trajectory becomes clearer. If current patterns continue over the next 2 to 5 years, China will likely deepen its investment in both naval capabilities and alternative trade routes. This is already visible in its expanding blue water fleet and its continued emphasis on infrastructure projects across Eurasia. Over a longer horizon, perhaps 10 years, the question becomes whether parallel systems emerge that reduce reliance on U.S.-secured routes, or whether the existing system adapts to incorporate multiple security providers. Neither outcome is guaranteed. Both carry risks. For the United States, the dilemma is different but equally complex. Maintaining global maritime security reinforces its strategic position, but it also requires sustained resource allocation and political commitment. As attention shifts toward other regions, particularly the Indo-Pacific, the cost of maintaining presence in multiple critical areas increases. There is no simple redistribution that does not create exposure somewhere else. Regional actors face their own calculations. Gulf states must balance relationships with both the United States and China. They rely on U.S. security guarantees, but increasingly depend on Chinese demand. This dual dependency constrains their strategic choices. It encourages hedging behavior rather than alignment. At the deepest level, the system is moving toward a condition where stability depends on overlapping and sometimes competing security arrangements. This is more complex than a single dominant provider, but also potentially more fragile. Coordination becomes more difficult. Miscalculation becomes more likely. The margin for error narrows. What would course correction require? It would require a reassertion of shared norms that reduce the need for constant enforcement. It would require confidence-building measures that lower perceived risk without relying solely on military presence. It would require political will from multiple actors, not just one, and it would require accepting that some level of strategic competition must be managed rather than resolved. The cost of such correction would not be evenly distributed. It would involve concessions, adjustments, and a willingness to operate within constraints that no single actor fully controls. That is difficult in an environment defined by competition, and this is where the analysis begins to converge on a more unsettling conclusion. Because the system is not breaking. It is evolving into something that looks stable on the surface, but functions differently underneath. There is one dimension left that rarely enters the discussion, yet quietly shapes all the others. It does not involve ships or oil or even immediate strategic calculations. It involves time. The surface fact is that policy decisions in major powers are increasingly influenced by domestic political cycles. Elections, leadership transitions, and internal economic pressures all shape external behavior. In the United States, foreign policy decisions, including military deployments, are influenced by congressional oversight, budget negotiations, and electoral considerations. These factors do not determine strategy alone, but they constrain it. One layer deeper, this introduces variability into commitments that were once perceived as stable. Allies and partners begin to factor in not only current policy, but potential future shifts tied to domestic politics. This affects credibility, not in the sense that commitments are abandoned, but in the sense that they are continuously reassessed. For China, the dynamic is different, but no less significant. Domestic economic performance, growth targets, and internal stability influence external posture. Energy security is not just a strategic concern. It is a domestic one. Reliable supply underpins industrial output, employment, and social stability. This creates pressure to secure resources, but also to avoid disruptions that could trigger economic stress. Now consider an actor that rarely appears in mainstream analysis of Hormuz. India. As one of the fastest-growing major economies and a significant importer of Gulf energy, India's position is often treated as secondary. Yet its imports from the Middle East remain substantial, and its naval presence in the Indian Ocean has been expanding. India's interest is not in controlling Hormuz, but in ensuring that its own access remains stable. This leads to a quiet increase in maritime capability and diplomatic engagement with Gulf states. It also introduces another variable into the regional equation. Understanding India's position changes the picture again. Because it adds a third major consumer of Gulf energy with its own strategic calculations. This complicates any binary framing of US and China. It suggests a future where multiple large actors seek to influence the same system, each with different priorities. At the deepest level, the consequence is cumulative. Domestic political cycles, economic pressures, and emerging actors all feed into a system that must remain stable despite increasing complexity. This does not make collapse inevitable, but it does make stability more contingent on continuous management across multiple dimensions. And that leads to a final observation before everything is brought together. The system that appears unchanged on the surface is being reshaped by forces that operate at different speeds and in different domains, and those forces are beginning to interact in ways that are not yet fully visible. If this kind of analysis is reaching you, then you already understand that most discussions stop before this point. If you want it to continue reaching others, subscribing and sharing is how that happens. So what does all of this actually tell us? It tells us that what appears to be a localized security adjustment in the Strait of Hormuz is in fact a systemic shift in how global stability is maintained and priced. The United States has not closed the strait, and oil continues to flow, yet the very need for visible naval enforcement has already altered how risk is distributed across the system. Insurance markets respond first, adjusting premiums based on perceived threat, and those adjustments ripple outward into global energy costs. According to the International Energy Agency, China remains the world's largest crude importer, with a significant share sourced from the Gulf, meaning even marginal cost increases compound into strategic vulnerability over time. At the same time, this is not simply an economic story. It is institutional. The principle of open sea lanes under frameworks like the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea still exists, but it is no longer operating on assumption alone. It is being actively reinforced. That distinction matters because it transforms a rules-based system into a managed system, where enforcement is concentrated in the hands of those with the capability to provide it. This creates asymmetry. China depends on the system, but does not yet control the conditions that guarantee it. Its response has been to hedge through overland energy routes and naval expansion, yet those hedges introduce new dependencies rather than removing risk entirely. Add to this the role of actors often treated as secondary, such as Saudi Arabia and India, and the structure becomes more complex. Saudi Arabia must balance price stability against volatility, while India quietly expands its maritime presence to secure its own energy lifelines. These overlapping strategies do not cancel each other out. They accumulate. The result is a system that appears stable but is increasingly contingent on continuous management across multiple actors with competing incentives. And before this analysis ends, there is one more thing that needs to be said clearly. The evidence does not point to imminent disruption. It points to a tightening system where small changes carry larger consequences than before. There are 3 developments worth watching closely in the coming months. First, any formal adjustment by the London insurance market to risk classifications in the Gulf will signal how institutional actors are pricing long-term instability. Second, changes in Chinese procurement behavior, including increased reliance on alternative suppliers or expanded strategic reserves, will indicate how seriously Beijing is recalibrating its exposure. Third, the scale and persistence of U.S. naval deployments in the region will reveal whether this is a temporary stabilization effort or the beginning of a more permanent posture. None of these developments alone determines the outcome. Together, they indicate direction. There is uncertainty in how quickly these shifts translate into structural change, but the trajectory itself is visible. The system is not breaking. It is becoming more managed, more conditional, and more dependent on the decisions of a smaller number of actors. This analysis is for educational and informational purposes only. It does not constitute policy advice, intelligence assessment, or advocacy for any government or political position. The perspectives presented here are drawn from publicly available sources and reflect Professor Liang Wu's independent analytical assessment alone. The voiceover in this video is generated using artificial intelligence technology. Viewers are encouraged to consult multiple sources, compare interpretations, and form their own conclusions based on a broad range of information and perspectives. Understanding how power actually operates is not a passive activity. It requires attention, skepticism, and a willingness to look beyond what is immediately presented. If this analysis has reached you, then you are already doing that work. Share this with one person who follows global events but may not yet see the structure beneath them. Every comment, every share, and every subscription is what allows this kind of analysis to continue reaching those who are looking for it. Leave one comment with your own assessment of where this situation leads next, or the country you are watching most closely. The next shift is already underway, and most people have not noticed it yet. I am Professor Liang Wu. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and never mistake a quiet news day for the absence of history being made.